Have you ever imagined leaving everything behind, traveling to a strange land, to marry a man you've never met, just for a chance at survival? That was the only choice Mara Ellison had. A woman forced to flee a painful past. She believed the Western man she was about to marry would be cruel and cold, just like people whispered. But when she set foot in the wind-swept land, the cowboy said one sentence that changed everything. I don't need a servant. I need a man who will stay with me. Amidst the white snow and vicious rumors, do you have the courage to step into a new life? If it were you, would you choose to turn your back, or choose to dare to believe once more? Today's story is not just about love, but the journey of two wounded souls finding their way back to the light. Listen in, and before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so I can continue to bring you healing and humane stories. The December wind brought a persistent Wyoming chill, making the sky at Red River Bend a motionless gray sheet stretching to the horizon. The steam train from the east had just slowed, its wheels crunching the thin layer of snow that covered the old track. When the last whistle sounded, Mara Ellison stood up, gently adjusting the old charcoal wool coat that had accompanied her for the 15,000-mile trip. She placed her trembling hand on the door handle of the train and took a deep breath. Stepping out of the train, Mara immediately felt the sharp cold of the west cut through her clothes and touched her cold cheeks. She stood still for a moment, as if to give her eyes time to adjust to the vast desolation before her. Red River Bend was smaller than she'd expected, a sparse row of wooden buildings set back from the foothills, a rectangular tavern with a sign that swayed in the wind, a grocery store with steamed-up windows, and farther away, a few low houses huddled together like old silhouettes against the western winter. The wind from the valley carried the thick smell of wood smoke and the pungent scent of sagebrush, a scent Mara had only known from sketchy letters of introduction to the land. She knew she wasn't the only one who had just gotten off that train, but she was certainly the only one who had made a decision big enough to change her life. A new life, a new land, a new man, whom she had never met, and a marriage, in the form of a mail-order bride. The phrase still weighed heavily on her chest, not because of shame, but because it was her last option to escape the loneliness that had been eating away at her for so many years. Mara bent down and picked up the worn leather suitcase, the kind only found in second-hand shops in the eastern suburbs. She tried to keep her breathing even despite the coldness of her hands. Her hazel eyes searched the sparse crowd in front of the station. Jonas McCade, the man who had sent her the 6-line letter, was probably among them. No one looks like a man waiting for his fiancée. She swallowed her disappointment and told herself not to expect too much. Jonas had said from the beginning that he wasn't the type to talk much or show emotion. That frankness reassured Mara. At least he wasn't lying to her with sweet words. A deep voice came from behind. "Where's Mara Ellison?" Mara turned back. A silver-haired woman in her 60s stood leaning on a walnut cane. Her eyes were gentle but sharp, as if she had seen through Mara's story without needing anyone to tell her. "Yes, I am Mara." The woman smiled, a smile Mara had not seen from anyone for a long time, simple but warm like a wood stove on a cold night. "My name is Clara Doyle. I have lived in Red River Bend for over 40 years. I hear there is someone new here today. Are you from far away?" "Yes, from Richmond, Virginia," Mara replied softly. Clara nodded, her eyes softening. "The East is perhaps full of memories, but not all of them are easy to carry." Her words took Mara by surprise, maybe because it felt like someone had touched an old wound without making it hurt anymore. She just nodded, her lips moving but no words forming. Clara put her hand on Mara's arm. "It's okay. Everyone here has some scars. That's why people come west. To find a place to breathe again?" Before Mara could reply, the sound of horse hooves echoed, slow but heavy, as if carrying the weight of a soul that had spent many years in silence. A man appeared at the end of the dirt road leading to the train station. He rode the sorrel with the air of a man familiar with the rough terrain of Wyoming. He was tall and sturdy, wearing an old leather jacket and a dark blue woolen scarf. A wide-brimmed hat hid his face, revealing only the contours of sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. Mara knew it was Jonas McCade without anyone saying it. He stopped his horse before her. He said nothing for a few seconds, just looked, as if trying to determine whether this woman, trembling slightly in the wind, was truly someone who wanted to accompany him or just another shadow that would eventually pass. Mara tried to clear her voice. "I'm Mara Ellison." Jonas nodded slightly. "I am Jonas." The wind blew, causing his scarf to flutter. He added slowly, as if each word was chosen from a long-standing reticence. "The trip must be tiring?" Mara replied softly. "Yes, it's fine." He nodded again, then dismounted and walked over to her. He didn't touch her, just took the suitcase as a matter of course for a Western man. "It's getting cold. We should go. It's a long way back to the ranch." Mara felt her throat tighten, not from disappointment nor from fear, but from Jonas's silence. Not like the distant, uncomfortable silence of anyone she had ever encountered. It's like a wall built to hide something more painful. Clara tilted her head slightly to look at Mara, her eyes filled with gentle meaning. "He's not as bad as he looks. It's just silent men often carry their own storms." Before Mara could reply, Jonas turned back and said simply, "If you're ready, let's go." No greetings, no polite questions, no questioning glances, only a deep, steady voice and the sorrowful calm of someone who has lost so much that he no longer dares to open the door of his heart too wide. Mara followed him, conflicted. She was both scared and strangely reassured. Worry was rising in her chest. Was this the right decision? Could a man who barely spoke be the place where she could reclaim her shattered life? But she had come this far. There was no turning back. There shouldn't be. And she knew in her heart sometimes only by daring to step into the silence of others can one hear one's true voice. As Jonas helped her into the carriage, Mara heard Clara call after her, her voice warm, steady, and as quiet as the West. "Take your time. Mara, this land, if it suits you, it will keep you." The wind carried the words down the red dirt road, into the sound of the wagon wheels rolling toward McCade Ridge, and into the courage Mara was mustering from the remaining pieces of her heart. The carriage left Red River Bend and headed into the sparse hills covered in a crust of frozen snow. Each wheel left a long, winding trail, like Mara's name written in the strange land she had just entered. The space around them was open, but there was a silence that made her heart tremble in an indescribable way. Jonas sat beside them, strong hands on the reins. The wind whipped past them, carrying the scent of old pines and the chill of the distant Wind River Mountains. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the station, but his presence wasn't tense. It was like a pillar of stability, unobtrusive, just there for others to lean on if they so desired. Mara stole a few glances at his face. It was strong, but tired, like someone who had just walked a long, painful path, and now had only enough strength to carry on by habit. The sadness in his eyes was not a fierce sadness, but a thin mist that covered his mind, slowing his every movement. She asked hesitantly, "Your farm. Is it far away?" Jonas looked straight ahead, his voice as deep as the breath of the earth beneath the ice. McCade Ridge lies at the northern edge of the forest. It's about a 2-hour ride from here. 2 hours, not a long time, but enough to make it clear to the newcomer that they were leaving the noise and entering a world apart. Mara clasped her hands together. Jonas glanced at her briefly, then turned to retrieve the wool blanket from the back of the car. "Put this on too. The wind is colder on the mountainside." He handed her the blanket without touching her hand. The small delicacy surprised Mara. This man had a way of showing concern without words, without making a fuss. The blanket carried the warmth of the horse's back and the simple sincerity of its owner. Mara said a small thank you. Jonas responded with a slight nod, as if he were not used to receiving gratitude. The path took them over a frozen stream. A few deer tracks lingered on the ice like question marks left in winter. As the wheels passed, the ice cracked softly. Jonas pulled gently on the reins, slowing down for safety. Mara watched his caution, realizing that he was not the type to act rashly. It was a long time before she dared to ask what had been bothering her since leaving town. Why did you choose to find a wife through mail? Jonas was silent for so long that Mara thought she had asked the wrong thing. But when he answered, his voice was calm, as if it had been thought out. I'm not good with words. I'm not good at interacting with many people. Life in the West doesn't have many options. I need someone who can live with me in a place with a large land and few people, and who is courageous. She turned to face him. Courage. She traveled from Virginia to Wyoming on a letter. Not everyone can do that. The words warmed Mara in a way she couldn't explain. It had been a long time since anyone had considered her choices admirable. Most thought she was running away or desperate. But Jonas saw something else. She took a deep breath of the cold air in front of her. Actually, I'm not sure I'm brave. I just have nowhere else to turn. Jonas turned to look briefly, the silence in his eyes softening a little. I know that feeling. Mara wanted to ask how, but something in Jonas's voice made her think he didn't want to open up at first. She respected that. The car continued into the wide valley. Snow covered the dry grass. The sun hid behind thick clouds, leaving a thin silver light over McCade Ridge, which was looming in the distance. The farm consisted of a large log house, several stables, a sheep pen, a barn, and a large expanse of land that stretched to the horizon. Smoke rose from the chimney, mixed with a thin, warm mist, like the breath of a home waiting. As the car approached the porch, Jonas spoke his first sentence with some obvious emotion. This is where I live. Not a proud introduction, but a confession both reserved and warm. Mara looked at the house before her. Not majestic or large, but solid and warm, in a way that made her feel a lump in her throat. For years, she had never had a place that truly belonged to her. Jonas helped her out of the car. He lifted the suitcase from the trunk as if it were something familiar. He went to the door and opened it with a lightness that belied his stern appearance. The firelight from the fireplace reflected off the oak walls, casting a warm glow that was like a reassuring, inviting voice. The smell of burning wood mixed with the scent of old fabrics, earth, and dried mint hanging near the window. It all made Mara nervous in a way that was both strange and familiar, like stepping into a house she knew in a dream but could not remember clearly. Jonas stood by the fireplace, dropping his gloves on the table. His movements were simple, yet imbued with an indecipherable calm. He pointed to the long wooden table near the window. You can sit down and rest for a while. I'll boil some water for you. She hesitated, surprised that he was doing it himself. Mara had thought Jonas was the type of man who left things to others, but he seemed to have lived alone long enough to be used to doing things on his own. When the water boiled, he placed a cup of hot tea in front of her. The steam rising up and caressing Mara's skirt. I don't know what you're drinking, but I have mint tea on hand. Thank you, Mara said, her voice small but sincere. Jonas pulled a chair a few feet away from her, keeping his distance so as not to make her uncomfortable. The fire crackled, the firelight illuminating his face, highlighting the deep weariness in his pale eyes. He asked softly, What are you most worried about when coming here? The question startled Mara because of its frankness, but also its concern. She bent down a little. I'm afraid I don't fit in here, and I'm afraid I'll be a burden. I'm afraid I won't be able to meet your expectations. Jonas looked her straight in the eyes. This time, his gaze was unusually serious. I don't need someone to boss me around. I don't need someone to do the housework. I need someone who won't leave. Mara's heart stopped. That, and the wounded look in his eyes, made her understand Jonas's silence was not coldness, but a sign of deep loss. She sensed the fear he was trying to hide, fear of being left behind again. She replied very softly, as if talking to herself, I'm also looking for a place to stay. In the silence, two people with their own wounds are groping to find a way to exist next to each other. No hasty promises. No explosive emotions. Only a genuine sympathy, small but deep, like a sprout emerging from the winter soil. A long but warm silence. Jonas stood up, lifting her suitcase. I'll show you the room first, so you can make arrangements. If you want to stay here, I... The last sentence was as light as a horse driver's breath, but it made Mara's heart tremble. If she wants to stay, those 3 words are not a question, but an acceptance. They are the open door for the person to come through. Mara pursed her lips and nodded slightly. I want to try. Jonas nodded and opened the door to her room. It was plain but clean, the bedding neatly laid out, and the window looked out onto the jungle. The dim afternoon light filtered through the glass and reflected off the chestnut wood floor. You should rest. Call me if you need anything. He left, the door closing so softly it was almost silent. Mara stood alone in her new room, her heart filled with relief and gentle wonder, not fear, but questions about the path ahead. A future so vast it was daunting. She placed her hand on her chest, where her heart beat slowly but deeply, as if making a soft sound. Perhaps a new life begins the moment we dare to enter the silence of others. And here, in that warm, firelit house, Mara felt she was beginning. A layer of silver light filtered through Mara's window, softening the space. The room carried the residual warmth from the fireplace below, after hours of sitting on the train, then swaying along the carriage. Her body was still tired, but this tiredness was different from the days in Virginia. It did not evoke painful memories, but rather the slight tiredness of someone who had just set foot on new land, not knowing what lay ahead, but already feeling a little lighter. Mara fixed her hair in front of the small mirror on the wooden table. As she opened the door and walked down the stairs, she smelled coffee. The warmth led her to the open kitchen. A long beam of sunlight filtered through the coarse curtains, making a long streak of light along the wooden table. Jonas was standing by the stove, his back to her. He wore a thick gray shirt, the sleeves rolled up slightly. His broad shoulders and sturdy stance made Mara stop in her tracks. He seemed used to starting things before anyone else. There was something both solid and lonely about his posture. Jonas turned around when he heard footsteps. I made coffee. Would you like some yes? Mara replied, a little surprised to see him doing this himself. He placed the cup of coffee on the table, his eyes still on the small pot boiling on the stove. I'm not a good cook, but this is easy to make. I think coffee is something that anyone can start with, whether it's a little strong or a little weak. Mara chuckles. Jonas looked at her for a few seconds as if assessing whether her words were sincere or just meant to please him. Finally, he nodded slightly. Just say it. I'm used to hearing the truth. That statement caught Mara's attention. This man really didn't tolerate any small details. It was both believable and made her wary of accidentally saying something that would hurt his feelings. They ate in silence. But the silence was warmer than the first time they met. The sound of spoons lightly touching cups, the wind blowing through the cracks in the wood of the farmhouse, all created enough rhythm to keep her from feeling confused. After eating, Jonas stood up and adjusted his thick coat. I have to check the north fence. It's been windy these days. If there's a break, the sheep will escape. Mara nodded, her hands slightly clenched on her skirt. How can I help? Around the house, Jonas looked at her for a long moment, making Mara feel like she was about to be rejected. But his words were gentler than she expected. You don't need to do anything today. Just look around the house and see if it suits you. When I get back, if you want, I can show you around. Mara bowed slightly. Okay. He went out, the door closing behind him, leaving the open space with the sound of the wind rushing against the wooden porch. Mara spent most of her time exploring the house. The dining table was old oak, lightly scratched, the armchairs by the fireplace, the cushions worn where they usually rested. The bookcase was simple but surprisingly full books on Western climates. A few old Bibles, a diary with a woman's handwriting that had faded almost completely. Mara lingered longer over that one. She didn't open it, but she sensed a memory in it. Her light footsteps led her to the area behind the house, outside the window. The wind blew through the old pine trees. The vast space had the wildness of a land that for many years belonged to no one but itself. It was near noon when Jonas returned. His coat was covered with dust and streaks of melted snow. Mara opened the door for him, feeling strangely glad that his return had made the house no longer empty. A section of the fence fell down. "I've put it back up. I'll fix it better tomorrow." He entered, his breath coming out in soft white puffs. Mara noticed his chapped hands, the hard lines of someone used to working outdoors. When her eyes fell on the long scar that ran from the back of his hand to his wrist, Jonas calmly pulled his sleeve over it, not trying to hide it, but not wanting her to notice. He said, his voice lower, "Let me show you around the ranch. Might as well show you where you live." Mara pulled on her coat and followed him. The air was cold against the pale blue sky. The dirt road around the farm led them past the east sheep pen. The sheep were large, their wool as thick as cotton, and they looked at them with round eyes. Jonas pointed to the cage. "This is wolf season. We need to check regularly. I was planning to hire more people in the spring, but I haven't found anyone I can trust." His words made Mara realize in part why he had chosen his mail-order wife. A large ranch, a man living alone, too many hidden hardships. They continued to the grassy knoll that overlooked the valley. Snow covered the ground in patches like a silvery blanket. Mara stared. So beautiful. Jonas was silent for a moment. His eyes were fixed on the misty horizon. "I built this house with my father. When he passed away, I tried to expand the ranch as he had originally planned. There were times when I thought I couldn't keep it." He paused, his voice low. "You see, I don't just live here. I'm trying to hold on to something. Sometimes I get so tired that I want to let go." Mara looked at him, her heart warming because Jonas had spoken so much for the first time. The words were not loud, not mournful, just small truths that came out in a moment of gentle wind. She replied in a voice as soft as the breath of earth after snow. "It is not easy to keep what you love, but the one who dares to keep it is truly strong." That made Jonas turn to look at her, his eyes deep and unreadable. They walked in silence for a while. When they returned to the house, the soft light from the wooden roof gave the farm a rare peace. Near the door, Jonas suddenly stopped. Immediately. She looked up. "I don't want you to take on anything beyond your ability. I just want you to know. I appreciate your presence here." A short sentence, but it touched the deepest part of Mara's heart. Her hands were cold, but her heart felt strangely warm. For the first time in years, she heard someone say they appreciated her presence. She nodded slightly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I also feel more at peace here." In that moment, the distance between them narrowed a little. Not because they were closer, but because they both let the other see their truest selves. Inside the house, the fireplace crackled again. Jonas stoked the fire, and the flare of light illuminated the sad lines of his face. Mara stood by the table, watching his every movement, her heart as calm as the water in a stone pool. She suddenly realized that Jonas's silence was not alienation. It was his way of protecting old wounds. And in that silence, she felt a slow, growing trust. A large ranch, a lonely cabin, a man with much pain, and a woman just finding her first step of peace. The first day at McCade Ridge ended with that feeling. It wasn't a strong, sublime feeling, but it touched deep inside like a thin thread connecting her heart to his. Not love. At least, not yet. But it was a step closer to something more beautiful they dared not name. Since arriving at McCade Ridge, Mara had grown accustomed to the sounds of the land. The wind slithering through the wooden roof as it changed direction, the horse treading its tires in the stable, the crackling of the fireplace as Jonas stoked the fire. The sounds created a steady soundtrack, helping her feel at home in a space that seemed too vast for a lone woman to cling to. She began to help with small chores around the house. She cleaned out the kitchen cupboards, washed the fireplace towels, dusted the dusty bookshelves. These tasks made her realize that Jonas had lived for years, putting things back in their proper places, but rarely felt the presence of others. There were corners of the house that looked as if the slightest touch would send old memories tumbling out. As she was rearranging some spice jars, Jonas entered, his voice deeper and softer than usual. "You don't need to do that. Just leave everything as it is." Mara smiled, not turning around. "I like it. The house is brighter when everything is put back the way it is." Jonas stood still for a moment as if trying to understand this small reason. Finally, he spoke in a slightly hoarse voice. "I'm not used to people touching my things, but if you feel comfortable doing so, then go ahead." That wasn't permission. It was more like a confession that her presence had begun to change the atmosphere. Jonas pursed his lips, as if he wanted to say something more but did not know where to begin. He moved closer to the window and looked out at the flock of sheep, which were clustered together in small white spots on the vast ground. "While I was out there," he said, his eyes still on the valley, "I thought a lot about why a woman like you decided to come here." Mara put the jar down and stepped closer, but kept a gentle distance. "I'm not running away from anything, if that's what you think. I don't think so." Jonas reached up and pushed the curtains aside, letting light fall on the wooden table. "I just want to understand. What brought you to this land? Really brought you here?" Mara breathed slowly, feeling her throat tighten as memories of her past came flooding back. But she knew she had to speak at some point. She couldn't move on to her new life if she kept it a secret. "I lost both my parents in 2 years," she said, her voice held back by a thin layer of steam. "My only remaining family always saw me as a burden. They said my life was no longer worth fighting for." Jonas turned back, not interrupting her, just looked, slowly, patiently. "I knew I had to leave Virginia." Mara continued, "But where was the problem? When I read your letter, it felt different from any invitation I had ever seen. You didn't promise happiness. You didn't sugarcoat anything. You just said you needed someone who wouldn't leave." Jonas's eyes darkened, as if something deeper was stirring inside him. "I say that because it is the truth. I know. And maybe that's why I believe you." The room fell into a long, but not uncomfortable, silence. It was as if they were standing on the edge of something undefined. Jonas clenched his hands, then released them. The small movement spoke of a struggle inside him, as if he wanted to share but was afraid to open up too much. "Some people left me behind," he said finally. "Not because they were bad, just because life was too hard for them. I don't blame them. But since then, I'm not sure who really wants to stay." Mara felt a slight pain in her heart, as if she had touched a still aching wound. "You don't have to say any more," she said gently. "I understand that fear. Losing someone makes you believe you don't deserve anyone else." Jonas closed his eyes for a few seconds. "Yes?" In that moment, Mara realized that Jonas's silence was not indifference, but a vulnerability hidden under a tough exterior. A sudden gust of wind blew across the edge of the woods. The window rattled. Jonas stood up. "Would you like to come with me another round? Just as long as you like?" "I want to go." Mara replied immediately. This time they went further than the day before, towards the border between the pine forest and the farm. They walked side by side, but not touching. Their footprints on the soft ground were parallel, not catching up but not diverging either. Coming to a low, rocky slope, Jonas stopped and pointed to the top. "You can see the whole valley from here. I often come up here when I need to think." Mara climbed after him. A gentle breeze touched her cheek, carrying the scent of old pines and damp earth. When she reached the top of the slope, she took a deep breath. The view before her was so vast it seemed as if nothing was hidden. Valley met forest. Forest met distant mountains, all overlapping like layers of memories of this land. Jonas stood beside her in silence for a moment, then spoke slowly. Immediately, she turned. If it feels like it's too much, you can tell me. I'm not good with words, but I'll try. Mara smiled. Her heart calmed like a stream after the wind. You don't have to try. Just be real. Jonas looked at her a long time. His eyes this time were not doubtful, nor hesitant. They were the eyes of a man who had seen a small ray of light in a journey he thought he would be alone on. His voice dropped to almost a breath. She makes the house less cold. That sentence made Mara turn away to hide the emotions that were rising like undercurrents. She knew this warmth was not the first step of a hasty love. It was like the first crack in a piece of ice, letting a few drops of warm water leak out. The change was so small that it was barely noticeable, but given enough time, it would turn into a flow. As they returned to the farmhouse, soft light covered the porch like a blanket. Mara paused to look at the house. A place that was once as silent as a long sleep now had the sound of a second footstep hitting the floor. Something was changing in McCade Ridge, and in her. No noise, no rush, not visible but really. Since settling into McCade Ridge, Mara felt that each day left a small mark on her heart. Not a clear mark like a big event, but like a leaf falling gently onto the water, each ripple spreading out, hard for outsiders to see. Those ripples came from the most ordinary moments, the warmth left on the cup of coffee Jonas placed in front of her, the look in his eyes when he returned from checking the fence, or the brief nod he gave when she put each corner of the house back in order. One gloomy afternoon, the clouds piled high like the backs of cows sleeping in the valley. Jonas returned looking strange. His coat was clinging to the ground. His hair was slightly disheveled. His blue-gray eyes held something Mara couldn't immediately read. It was as if a storm had passed through him. Not a storm of the sky, but a storm of his heart. She came closer. What's the matter? Jonas put his hat down on the table firmly. I met Sheriff Blake down in town. He wanted to warn us about a group of herders from Timber Hollow passing through the area. Mara listened to every word. They're not bad people, Jonas continued, but they tend to be difficult when they don't get along. The sheriff said they were looking for a place to stay before the new snows. She pressed her fingers together lightly. Can they come near our ranch? Not sure, but the land in this area is open. Anyone passing through might want to find a place to camp. Jonas's voice dropped, as if he were speaking to his own old worries. The uneasiness of someone who had lost something important and now feared something else would be taken away. Mara studied his face. The slight tension in his jaw did not mask the deeper confusion. What are you most worried about? She asked. Jonas was silent for a moment. When he answered, his voice was as low as water flowing in the shadows of the forest. I don't want you to get into trouble. You've only been here a short while. The peace I try to keep at this ranch. I don't want anyone or anything disturbing it. Mara knew at once that the worry was not because of trouble for the farm, but because of something beyond her strength. The concern made her heart tremble like the gently touched strings of a violin. She stepped closer, gently placing her hands on the edge of the table. I'm not as weak as you think. I can face outsiders, but I thank you for worrying about me like this. Jonas looked at her for a long second, a look that made Mara feel as if she were standing before a door he had kept locked for years now slightly open. He took a slow breath, as if deciding something. Mara, there's something I need to tell you. The atmosphere changed instantly. Mara stood up straight, her face tilted slightly, waiting. Jonas placed his hands on the back of the chair, his fingers fidgeting as if searching for support. There were times, he said, when I didn't know I was good enough for you to stay here. Mara's heart sank at those words, not because of fear of loss, but because she recognized the real pain swirling in the chest of the man before her. She took a small step forward, keeping her voice steady. Why do you think so? I carry many things that are not easy to share. There are days when I am so silent that even I am afraid that I will lead others astray. You don't lead me astray, Mara said. Each word sure. Silence isn't scary if it's not meant to hurt someone. Jonas looked up. his gaze filled with something rare and fragile. I'm afraid I'll repeat the same mistake. Afraid of making the person next to me feel lonely? That sentence made Mara gasp as if she had just avoided a big wave. She did not hesitate, did not falter, just spoke in a soft voice. You don't make me lonely. I was lonely before I met you, and I know what it feels like. Here. I don't see it. Jonas looked at her for a long moment, as if confirming that she wasn't speaking to comfort him. She was speaking from her own experience. Another silence appeared, not the silence of distance, but of a softening in two souls. Outside, the wind shifted, rustling dry leaves on the stable roof. The air hinted at the coming snow. Jonas stood up straight. If you want, let's check the doors and windows. I want to make sure there are no drafts tonight. Okay, I'll go with you. They walked around the house together. Mara held the oil lamp, its light reflecting off the wooden walls. Jonas checked every window, every panel, every latch. They worked slowly. There was no talking, but the coordination was like two people learning to walk a path together. As he finished checking the west side of the ranch, Jonas paused to watch the darkening sky. You see, he said, with such low clouds it will snow heavily. Mara raised the lamp higher. What do you usually do when it snows heavily? I make fires and fix things around the house. Sometimes I read. Jonas glanced at her. And you, I often read old letters. Or rewrite a few things to relieve the fullness in my heart. Jonas frowned slightly. You brought old letters. There are a few. Mara kept her voice steady. My mother's. Though she tried to remain calm, she knew Jonas heard the pain in her voice. But instead of asking more, he spoke in a very soft voice. If one day you want to tell, I will listen. Mara felt the promise like a small flame in the palm of her hand. No pressure, but no demands. Just a space to choose when she was ready. As they returned to the house, the snow began to fall in large flakes, hitting the eaves with a distinct thud. Mara stood near the fireplace, her hand on her chest. Jonas stepped beside her, carrying the cold air with him but his eyes warmer than the fire. Mara, he said, his voice low but sincere. I want you to know this. If there is anything that is troubling you, no matter how small, tell me. I don't want you to suffer alone. Mara looked into his eyes. In them, she saw not only his long-standing loneliness, but also his desire to protect her, his desire to give her a real place in his life. I will, she replied, but I hope you will tell me when you are feeling down. Jonas took a deep breath. I will try. They stood there for a long moment, close but not touching. Snow was falling outside. The fireplace crackled softly inside. It felt like everything had slowed down to allow something bigger to begin to form between them. Not easy love, not hasty promises, but trust that blossoms from two broken souls. A real, slow, and durable platform. The heaviest snow in weeks blanketed the valley like a white blanket over McCade Ridge. The light outside the windows was cold, the kind that made one want to stand closer to the fireplace even though it was warm inside. Mara made tea in the kitchen, the faint scent of mint mingling with the warmth. As she poured it into a china cup, she heard Jonas coming down the stairs. His steps seemed heavier than usual. Mara looked up and noticed his face was tense, as if something had been on his mind all night. Can't you sleep? She asked, her voice soft and low. Jonas pulled up a chair and took a deep breath. The wind is strong. I hear the back door creaking. The hinges must be a little loose. He said so, but Mara knew the wind was not the only reason he could not sleep. A thin cloud fell over his eyes, making them darker than usual. She placed the cup of tea before him. The steam softened the lines of his tense face. Mara, Jonas said after a long pause. Sheriff Blake left a message. There's a group from Timber Hollow making new footprints near the eastern border. Not sure what they want. Mara placed her hands on the armrests of the chair, her body stiffening slightly instinctively. They won't come here, will they? I'm not sure. Jonas looked toward the window, where the wind was blowing the pine branches, their shadows on the ground like lines of liquid ink. But if they're looking for shelter, my ranch is the easiest place to see. The silence stretched slightly, like a tight string being tightened. Jonas lowered his eyes to the table, his hands resting on top of each other. I don't like suspicion, he said, but I don't want you to get into any trouble. I don't want to be the cause of your worry. Mara let out a soft breath, her eyes searching his face. I can take care of myself. I know. Jonas replied softly, but that doesn't make me any less worried. That simple truth made Mara choke. It was not easy for a man like Jonas to say that. It was not easy to admit that he was afraid of losing someone again. A faint noise sounded on the porch. Jonas stood up at once, his movements quick and instinctive. I'll go out and see. I'm going with you. Mara put down her teacup and put on her coat. It's safer in here, Jonas said quickly, but Mara's eyes answered clearly enough. Okay, but stay behind me. They opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The wind blew the sand and snow high, rustling against the railing. Jonas walked ahead, his eyes scanning the ground. Mara followed, her hands shaking but her legs unfaltering. Several strange shoe prints appeared on the deep snow. The prints were quite deep, indicating that the person was heavy or carrying something large. Mara looked down, feeling the cold from the snow spread up her legs. Is this the mark of a timber hollow person? Jonas did not answer at once. He knelt down and brushed away the snow with his hands. Hard to say, he said, his voice low, but not mine, nor anyone else's in this area. He stood up, his whole body tense like a bow drawn to a string. They came closer than I thought. Why would they want to come here, Mara asked. If they just want to stay temporarily, I don't object. But this group often causes trouble when they drink or when they see someone vulnerable. Mara felt her heart rate increase slightly. What can they do? Jonas looked at her. I won't let anything happen to you. The determination in his eyes was so strong that Mara was speechless for a few seconds. Something warm spread through her chest. Not because she was weak and needed protecting, but because being placed in such an important position by someone with as much pain as Jonas made her heart flutter in a new way. A gust of wind whipped snow down from the roof. Jonas put his hand on Mara's back and led her into the house. Go inside. I'll lock the door behind you. When Jonas returned, he stood by the window watching the eastern border as if anyone who crossed it were a threat. Jonas's shadow on the wall was long, like a man brooding in a storm. Mara approached, standing beside him, keeping enough distance so as not to startle him. How long have you been living like this? She asked softly. Jonas sighed, not turning around. Long enough to get used to not having anyone there when things go wrong. But you are not alone now, Mara said, her voice soft but unflinching. Even if I cannot be of much help, I am still here? Jonas turned to look at her, his eyes as if they had just touched the deepest part of him that he had long tried to keep hidden. You don't understand, he said slowly. I had people standing beside me. Then I lost them. Lost them in a way that made me think, maybe I shouldn't let anyone stand in that position again. Mara lightly clenched her hand on the hem of her shirt, as if to steady her heart that was tightening because of that confession. You fear something will happen again, she said softly. Jonas nodded slowly, his acceptance like a stone dropped into a still pond. I'm afraid of losing again. Afraid, if someone chooses to be with me, I won't be good enough to keep them. Mara stepped a little closer to him. Jonas, you don't have to hold me to anything. Nothing to prove, nothing to be strong or perfect. I'm here because I want to be here. Jonas looked at her, unguarded, in that moment. Mara saw his eyes filled with old pain, but also with a new hope, just emerging from the thick snow. It was like a small flame flickering in a fireplace when the wind blows, still trying to keep itself from going out. Mara. Jonas called her name, his voice hoarse. Thank you. Not a polite thank you, but the words of someone who had just been saved from a rising fear. The snow didn't stop. But inside the house, it was much warmer. That night, they ate in a gentle silence. Mara watched Jonas's hands tremble as he lifted his glass. She realized he was shaking not because he was cold, but because something was trying to say something that he couldn't find the words for. As she put away the dishes, Jonas stood by the kitchen door, leaning his shoulder lightly against the wooden frame. "Mara," he said, "I want to say this before nightfall." She turned back and waited calmly. "If anyone from Timber Hollow comes near the ranch, I want you close to me. Not because you're weak, but because I need to know where you are." That sentence made Mara slow down his breath. "I will stand beside you," she said. "If you allow me." Jonas looked at her, his gaze so deep it was hard to read. "I want that," he said. That night, as the wind howled outside, Mara lay in her room, listening to Jonas's footsteps in the hallway. He was checking the door, checking the latch, checking every panel of wall to make sure there were no cracks for wind or strangers to slip through. Not the usual vigilance of Westerners, but the vigilance of someone who has lost too much and is afraid of losing what is growing inside. That made Mara sigh in the darkness, not because of worry, but because she was understanding Jonas and understanding herself. That his silence was an invitation into a lonely world whose door he did not know how to open. And she was opening that door slowly, with all the gentleness she had. Days of snow had covered the ground so white that it was hard to tell where the ranch line was, and where the trail leading down into the valley was. Mara stood by the window, her hand resting on the cool glass, watching the mist-filled sky. In the distance, a flock of black crows could be seen flying in arcs, a stark contrast against the pale white. The air was so quiet that you could hear the wood expand slightly in the cold. Jonas left the porch early. Mara saw him disappear behind the stables. There was a weight to every step Jonas took. Not the weight of a body, but the weight of someone carrying things he did not know how to put down. Mara put on her coat, ready to go out and help him since yesterday's snow had slightly collapsed a corner of the barn. She thought Jonas would need help clearing the snow around the east fence. As she reached the kitchen door, the sound of horse hooves echoed from the ranch gate. Mara stopped, her heart skipping a beat. A group of 3 horsemen approached, their dirty gray cloaks, hoods pulled low, and their carefree demeanor made Mara uneasy. A worry from days before resurfaced like a gust of wind to a wound. Jonas emerged from behind the sheepfold, his eyes changing as soon as he saw the group. He walked straight toward them, his steps sure but tight with each step, like someone ready to shield something important behind him. The man at the head of the group had a patchy beard, a worn coat, and a familiar look of arrogance in his eyes. He dismounted from his horse, a half smile on his face. "Long time no see." "Jonas McCade." Jonas did not smile. "I remember telling you to stay away from this land. The ground is for anyone to use." "Jonas, we only need shelter for a few days. The snow is very deep." His tone was falsely polite, yet the disrespect was evident beneath the calm. The 2 men behind him looked around the farm as if assessing everything. Jonas maintained a calmness that Mara knew only came from years of endurance. "It's okay to take shelter, but don't bring more trouble." The man laughed. "I bring trouble, Jonas. You think too highly of us. We are just wayfarers." Mara stood behind the door, watching. She didn't want to interrupt before she understood, but Jonas's eyes flickered to her, letting her know he was aware of her presence and trying to keep her safe. "What's your name?" one of the group asked, looking straight at Mara. Mara took a step back. Jonas stepped forward, his voice hard. "It has nothing to do with you." The bearded man chuckled. "Oh, look who it is. Looks like Mr. McCade has finally found someone who is here with him. She doesn't look like a Westerner." He took another step, sinking the snow beneath his feet. His gaze lingered on Mara's face, making Jonas tighten his grip. "Stop," Jonas said low, but clear as air. The man shrugged. "Just kidding. We just need some food and shelter for the night. We are neighbors after all." Jonas looked at him long enough for the man to look away. Finally, Jonas spoke through white breath. I'll take the food out behind the barn. Don't you come into the house and don't go near the porch. Don't talk to her. His voice was low, but the weight beneath it was undeniable. The three men looked at each other, then turned their horses and headed toward the edge of the farm. As they disappeared around the slope, Jonas turned back to look at Mara. Are you okay, fine? Mara said, but her heart was pounding. He stepped closer. If they come back, you stand behind me. I know, Mara said, but I don't want you to face it alone. Jonas leaned down slightly, his eyes filled with an unnamed emotion, as if he were looking at the one person who could pull him out of a long darkness. I don't intend to leave you alone, but I also won't let anyone hurt you. The words had barely sunk in Mara when the sound of a horse echoed from the woods. Not the three men. A single horse, closer, clearer. A strange man appeared. His horse was tired. His cloak was covered in snow. His face was slightly bruised. He shouted loudly, I need to see the rancher. It's important. Jonas stepped out. I am the landowner. The man bowed his head in thanks and spoke quickly. I was passing by this property last night. I saw someone lurking in the shadows. It looked like they were trying to get into your house. I thought it was just a passerby. But when I got to Timber Hollow this morning and heard Hank's group boasting about how they were clearing the way to get some supplies from this ranch, I thought I'd let you know. Jonas held his breath for a moment. Are you sure? I can't say for sure. But I saw a man walking around the barn, leaning down to the back window. Mara shivered. The back window, Jonas asked again. His voice changed. Yes. The door to the kitchen. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was quite small and walked very quickly. Mara spun around. She knew that window was where she had stood pouring tea last night. She had seen shadows in the pane, but thought they were just the shadows of trees caught in the strong wind. Jonas clenched his jaw. Thanks for telling me. The man left, leaving the ground covered in mist and a stony silence. Mara looked at Jonas and saw that he was holding back something so as not to worry her. Jonas. He turned, his eyes as deep as the lake when the wind stopped. You didn't do anything wrong, he said before she could ask. But this really worries me. Mara heard that. His heart ached. Are you worried about the ranch? She asked softly. No, Jonas replied immediately. I'm worried about you. The two words for you echoed through the air like a vein flowing through ice. Real, warm, and more powerful than anything Mara had ever heard in her life. But as if fate wanted to test them once more. A sudden call rang out from the forest. Mara Ellison. They both turned. A woman on horseback appeared, moving so fast that snow flew under her hooves. As she approached, she pulled down her hood. It was Clara Doyle. Her face was full of worry. Mara, you have been framed. Jonas turned completely. What accusation? Clara took a deep breath. People in town are saying there's been sightings of a woman around the stables at your ranch. They say it's the new girl. They think she wants to sabotage you and force you to sell your land. Mara was stunned. Jonas stepped closer to Clara, his voice turning icy. No one should talk about her like that. Jonas, Clara said, rumors spread fast. If we don't clear things up, people will think you're both hiding something. Jonas turned to Mara. His eyes wavered for a moment, as if some old fear had awakened. Not fear of her guilt, but afraid of losing her because of the cruelty of the world? Mara, he said, his voice heavy but warm. You did nothing. I believe that. Mara felt a lump form in her throat. The belief he had just spoken was not the lightest of comforts. It had weight, history, pain, and courage. It is the kind of trust that only those who have been deeply betrayed can fully understand its value. She took a step toward him, her eyes glistening but not tearful. Thank you, Jonas. The wind whipped the snow up, carrying their words into the silvery air. That single word of faith was what carried them into the next climax of their lives. Rumors traveled faster than any wind that had ever swept through Red River Bend. Mara heard her name mentioned in vague stories, as if she were a lurker in the woods, someone who had come from far away to sow unrest. The twisted truth made her feel like a thin layer of ice had been spread across her heart. Not the ice of winter, but the ice of prejudice she had fled from the east. But unlike her days in Boston, this time she did not run. Jonas stood behind her, like a tree in the bone-chilling cold. The next morning, Sheriff Blake appeared at the ranch gate. He tied up his horse, brushed the snow from his cap, and looked at Jonas with the thoughtful eyes of a man who has seen much in life. "I need to talk to both of you," he said. Jonas led Mara onto the porch. Her face was calm, but her breathing was shallow. She knew this conversation could be a turning point. Not in their reputations, but in their futures. Sheriff Blake began slowly. "Yesterday I heard some people in town talking about a woman's figure appearing near your stable. The rumor spread far and wide, and some people wanted to come up here to investigate." Jonas frowned. "I don't accept that. If someone starts a fight, I'll defend her." The sheriff raised his hand slightly to calm himself. "I understand. That's why I came first. To clear something up." He turned to Mara, his eyes old but not doubtful. "Where were you the day it happened?" Mara replied without hesitation. "I'm in the kitchen. Clara Doyle can confirm I'm staying home until the snow stops. I'm not leaving the ranch." The sheriff nodded immediately. "I believe you." Jonas let out a small breath. The seemingly ordinary words were so life-saving that Mara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The sheriff put his hands in his coat pockets and continued. "Actually, I caught one of Hank's gang hanging around the town marketplace this morning. He said he had been here earlier, just to see if there was anything easy to take from the ranch. The shadow people saw could have been him or one of his accomplices." Jonas clenched his fists. "I also heard them boasting that they threw some small objects around the kitchen window to see if anyone went out." The sheriff added, "But I guess the snow was so heavy that the tracks were obscured." Mara realized she had heard the strange noise outside her window the day before. Now she understood. The sheriff looked at her with a softer gaze than before. "I'll have you know that rumors are sometimes worse than the weather. We'd be in trouble if someone didn't come forward to confirm the truth. You did nothing wrong. Mara Ellison." Mara bowed her head, feeling as if an invisible string had been untied from her heart that had been tightening for many days. The sheriff turned to Jonas. "I suggest you keep strangers off the ranch for now. If necessary, I'll have someone patrol the woods behind." Jonas nodded. "I appreciate that." The sheriff retied his horse's reins and prepared to leave. Before he mounted his horse, he said something that both of them would remember for a long time. "Not everyone who comes from another place brings trouble. Sometimes they bring something better than spring." When the sheriff was gone, the ranch gate returned to silence. Jonas turned to look at Mara. There was no doubt in his eyes, only something deep and steady. "You heard me?" he said. "The sheriff has cleared the air. You won't have to put up with any more baseless rumors." Mara looked down at the gloves she held, her voice low but unwavering. "I'm used to having to bear the brunt of things I didn't do. But this time, I don't want to bear it anymore." "When you're not alone," Jonas said, his voice growing deeper, "things will be different." That made Mara look up. There was a special silence between them, where the snow did not touch, only the warmth they shared. Jonas held out his hand. Mara did not hesitate to place it in hers. His hand was dry, warm, and strong as the land he guarded. He led her into the house. The fire was burning red in the hearth. Jonas stood before the stove for a moment, as if trying to sort out the thoughts that had been weighing heavily on his mind for so long. "There's something," Jonas said, his voice deeper than usual. "I've been holding it in too long. Maybe it's time to say it." Mara listened silently. "I used to think that silence was the only way to protect what was left. I rarely talked to people, and almost never let anyone into my life. That made people think I was unlovable and closed off. I let them think that, because I believed if I opened my heart again, I would lose more people, His eyes looked beyond the fire, as if looking at the old gravel road behind life. But since you came here, I realized one thing. Sometimes silence is not a wall, but a rope that binds pain to me. I keep holding onto it, not knowing that I need to let go to move on. He turned back to look straight at Mara. You make me want to let go. In that moment, the air in the room seemed to come alive. The fire reflected Jonas's eyes, and Mara saw the truth in them. He wasn't just explaining. He was giving her the most vulnerable part of himself. Mara stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his chest. I too carry the wounds of where I left them. But when two wounds meet in the right way, they can sometimes heal together. Jonas bowed his head slightly. His forehead touched hers. There was no hasty kiss, no spontaneous gesture, just a silent embrace of two hearts. A long time passed like that. Softly, peacefully, so real that everyone felt that this was the language they understood together. Outside, the thick layer of snow had begun to melt as the sun rose higher. Water streaked down the eaves, a sign of the approaching season. The change didn't exactly make a sound, but it did make the whole place feel warmer. Mara looked out and said softly, Jonas, do you think this place can really become my home? Jonas squeezed her hand, his voice low but firm. I don't need someone to make my meals or sweep the porch. I need someone to stay with. Just like the title of the story you feared, I don't need a servant. I need someone to stay with me. Mara smiled a gentle, deep smile, like it had been there all along but had never had a chance to show itself. I want to stay. The words were like a chest taking its first full breath. Jonas closed his eyes, as if to engrave that moment deep in his heart. When he opened his eyes, he gently pulled Mara into his arms. The wind from the porch carried the scent of pine and damp earth. It all blended into the beginning of something new, right and lasting. After months of living with the fear of being an outsider in someone's life, Mara felt like she finally found a place to belong. A place that was imperfect, but true. A person who was imperfect, but knew how to love with the power of silence. And so, in a wooden house in the middle of a remote land, two wounded souls found peace not through flowery words, but through the simplest choices in life. Stay. Mara and Jonas's story reminds us that, at any age, we carry wounds that are difficult to name. But the miracle is, sometimes healing doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from a kind word, a hand willing to hold, or simply deciding to stay instead of running away. Many people in their 60s experience loss, loneliness, or feelings of being misunderstood. But this story reminds us that the heart never grows old. It is still capable of moving, trusting, and finding peace, as long as we don't close the door on our lives. Jonas learns that silence doesn't always protect us. Mara understands that sometimes a new path is a chance to be born again. Together they show that love doesn't heal everything, but it gives us the courage not to give up. Thank you for accompanying and listening until the end. If you love this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can meet again in the next emotional journeys.